Hey everyone, so it was interesting when I was researching for my review of their Satanic Majesty's Request, I became fascinated with Brian Jones. It's amazing how much he accomplished in his short life. In addition to forming and naming the Rolling Stones, Jones co-wrote and contributed to some of their most diverse and memorable songs. And while he was a talented multi-instrumentalist, he never seemed to write any of his own songs, which just deepens his mystery for me. And this question kept coming up. Who was Brian Jones? Born on February 28, 1942 as Louis Brian Hopkins Jones Jr., he lived a relatively good middle-class life in southwestern England. He had two little sisters, the eldest of which died of leukemia when he was just 3 years old. He developed asthma not long after. His parents were both musically inclined. His father was a piano teacher as well as an aeronautical engineer, while his mom played piano and organ and was active in music at the local church. Jones grew up listening to classical music but preferred jazz and blues, especially the music of Elmore James and Robert Johnson. He did quite well in school, often excelling at his exams with little to no effort, but he didn't like the conformity that school brought, especially with the uniforms and authority figures. He was active in sports and music, playing saxophone, clarinet, and guitar. When he was 17, he got his girlfriend pregnant and dropped out of school altogether. And at some point between 1961 and 1962, Jones moved to London, where he became entrenched in the blues scene there, making friends with Alexis Corner, Paul Jones, later of Manfred Mann, and future Cream bassist Jack Bruce. And for a while, he called himself Elmo Lewis, and he was known for his slide guitar work. He started a group with Paul Jones called the Roosters, but he left in 1963. In early May of 1962, Jones placed an ad in the paper seeking musicians to be in a blues band. Ian Stewart was the first to join, followed by Mick Jagger and Jagger's childhood friend Keith Richards. They practiced 3 days a week in a room above the Bricklayers Arms pub in Soho. The pub is now a music store and a record label, and the spot where they used to rehearse is now the store owner's living room. Their big break happened when Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated was to appear on BBC Radio's Jazz Club program, leaving their weekly gig at the Marquee Club open. Jones persuaded the club's owner, Harold Pendleton, to let the then unnamed Stones fill in the spot. When asked for the band's name over the phone, Jones saw a Muddy Waters record on the floor and took the name from the song Rolling Stone. The rest of the band didn't really like it, but no one came up with anything better, and the name obviously stuck. They played their first gig on Thursday, July 12, 1962 with Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Brian Jones, Ian Stewart on piano, bass player Nick Taylor, and either Tony Chapman or Mick Avery on drums, as there's some contention as to who was actually playing that night. At any rate, the gig led to a residency at the Crawdaddy Club. Things were looking up for the band, but cash was still tight, and in order to save on money, Jones, Jagger, and Richards all moved in together in August of 1962. They lived together for about a year in this run-down Chelsea flat. Bass player Bill Wyman described it as bomb damage, with dirty dishes, dusty furniture, and perpetually damp walls. But I believe this was vital in the formation of the Stones, as it really solidified the bond of that trio. They spent a ton of time listening to blues records, staying up late, practicing. It was here that Jones taught Jagger how to play harmonica, and where Richards and Jones developed their unique guitar weaving style that helped to make the band stand out among the other blues bands in the London scene. At this time, Brian saw himself as the band's manager, often seeking £5 extra more than the other members for the same show. And while he was instrumental in getting the band together, forming their initial sound, and booking their first gigs, when the rest of the band found out about his extra pay, needless to say, it did not sit well, forming the first cracks between Jones and the band. In May of '63, the Stones signed Andrew Oldham to be their manager, and even he noticed a distance. Oldham remarks that on their first tours in '63, Jones would often travel separately from the band and stay at different hotels. But I think the real issue for Jones was that Oldham wanted to change the band. You see, he saw the Stones as a potential antithesis to the Beatles. He thought, and rightfully so, that for every Beatles fan, there is going to be a young person who doesn't identify with the squeaky clean appeal of the Beatles. So he was instrumental in pushing the Stones to become much more dirty and grittier. He also pushed the band to create more originals and not do as many blues covers. Part of his plan was to create a Lennon-McCartney writing duo out of Jagger and Richards, and famously, whether true or not, locked them in a room together until they came out with some original songs. Now, I've read in a ton of places that Jones did not like this new direction for the band because he always saw them as a blues act. But even if he did, I feel like he got over it because he's the one member who really embraced non-blues instruments such as recorders, sitars, flutes, mellotrons, and really tapped into the psychedelic movement. If anything, I think having Oldham, who was 19 and younger than anyone in the band, and this kid was calling the shots, I don't think that sat well with Jones, not to mention the fact that he saw his role in the band diminishing. As the Stones gained popularity and wealth, time on the road also increased, and perhaps as a way to cope with all three, Jones turned to drugs and alcohol. This did not help things. I think he already had a fragile mental state, and using had a huge effect on his physical and mental well-being. The other Stones remarked that there were days when he could be the best person in the room, and then there were days where he could be the worst. Years later, Richards would say that Jones wasn't the type who could handle the fame and fortune.
My ultimate aim in life was never to be a pop star. I enjoy it, with reservations. Let's face it, the future as a Rolling Stone is very uncertain.
In 1965, Jones met Anita Pallenberg, a 21-year-old model who I believe was the love of his life. They both spoke German and instantly hit it off, and the two quickly became lovers. She really helped to develop his rock star persona by cutting his hair into his signature look and getting him to wear flamboyant clothing. But by 1967, their relationship was strained by drugs and alcohol. Jones and her began to experiment with LSD, which really took a toll on his mental state, giving him really bad nightmares. He also turned physically abusive towards Anita, spurred by mood swings and fits of jealousy. Things came to a head when Richards, her, and Jones took a trip to Morocco. Jones got sick and had to go home early, leaving Richards and Pallenberg alone, and they quickly fell for each other. She left Jones soon after, and I feel like this really rocked his world, further straining his relationship with Richards, which made finishing Their Satanic Majesty's request even more difficult. And I totally understand that feeling he had, being alienated from the rest of the group, like no one has your back. I can only imagine that this drove him further into his addictions. While he did contribute to most of the tracks on 1968's Beggar's Banquet, he was very unreliable, hard to work with, and often wouldn't show up with the right equipment. I mean, it got so bad that during rehearsals, the band would often just turn off his amplifier because he wasn't contributing. In May of 1968, he was arrested for possession of marijuana, and while he wasn't jailed, he ended up paying a fine and walked away with a drug conviction which would come to haunt him the following year. And his legal troubles continued into March of 1969 when he borrowed the group's Jaguar and it was towed, and then a few months later in May, he crashed his motorcycle through a store window. It was quickly becoming clear to the Rolling Stones management that Jones was a hindrance. By the time the sessions for Let It Bleed were wrapping up, he had all but checked out, only playing on 2 tracks, Midnight Rambler and You Got the Silver. By June of '69, the Stones were gearing up for their first US tour since 1966 when their management was informed that because of Jones' drug conviction, he would not receive a work permit and therefore could not tour. At the suggestion of Ian Stewart, their road manager and touring pianist, they decided to let Brian go, and on June 8, 1969, Jones was informed that he would no longer be a part of the band. Although to the public, it was made to look as if Jones left on his own terms. He was replaced by 20-year-old guitarist Mick Taylor, formerly of John Mayall's Blues Breakers. And I'm sure it was a hard decision for the band, as Jones was the founding member and their friend. But he was a problem, and he wasn't getting any better. I like to think that maybe this sharp break was meant to be a wake-up call and that the band hoped he would come back. But unfortunately, this did not happen. After leaving the Stones, he retreated to his home, Cotchford Farm in East Sussex, and according to Alexis Corner, it seemed like Jones was getting better. He went as far as to contact some of his musician friends, talking about starting a new band, and he even demoed a few songs of his own. However, none of that was to pass, as sometime after midnight on July 3rd, Jones passed away. He was discovered motionless at the bottom of his swimming pool by his girlfriend. The coroner's report concluded his death was caused by misadventure, as it was noted his heart and liver were enlarged by drug and alcohol abuse. His death was felt by many of his contemporaries. Both Pete Townsend and Jim Morrison wrote poems for him, and even Jimi Hendrix dedicated a song to him on US television. The Stones performed a concert in his name just 2 days after his death on July 5th, 1969, even though originally the concert was intended to introduce their new guitarist, Mick Taylor. Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts were the only Stones at Brian's funeral. But what's even worse, his passing at 27 would be only the first of many that ripped through the rock world. Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and Jim Morrison all died at the age of 27, and Morrison actually died 2 years to the day that Brian did. All four are now considered part of the 27 Club, and I have to assume that Jones played a large part in spurring the idea of that club. In the end, all we have is the tragic tale of yet another young, talented musician who struck it rich with a phenomenal band, but was ultimately sidetracked by drugs and alcohol. He left us way too soon, just as he was coming into his own and starting to explore his own songwriting abilities. Sadly, the only officially released song that he is credited as writing is Thank You for Being There, but even that was based on his poem, and he didn't even write the music. To get a real flavor of his writing style, I highly recommend seeking out his soundtrack to the film A Degree of Murder from 1967. Unfortunately though, it's never been officially released, so you'll either have to watch the film or source a bootleg. He also played saxophone on You Know My Name by the Beatles, and also the Vibe-a-Slap during the opening of All Along the Watchtower by Jimi Hendrix. It's unfortunate that we'll probably never get to know who he really was because he kept so much of himself guarded. Clearly he had some issues to work on, and I'm sad he didn't receive the help he needed. But I think it's important to remember him for all that he gives us and continues to give us with his brilliant contributions to fantastic songs like Ruby Tuesday, Paint It Black, Mother's Little Helper, Under My Thumb, and many others. Some of them are included on their Satanic Majesty's request. Now, if you want to learn more about Brian Jones and the early Rolling Stones, I highly recommend checking out the well-researched book Brian Jones, The Making of the Rolling Stones, and the documentary film Crossfire Hurricane. Now, there are some conspiracy theories out there that claim he was murdered. I don't subscribe to them myself, as I believe it's far more likely that he passed out and drowned. But if you're interested in the subject, check out the 2005 film Stoned. It dramatizes the last year of his life and plays into the theory that Jones was murdered by Frank Thorogood. Well guys, that'll do it for this time around. I want to thank you so much for watching. Be sure to leave me a comment down below letting me know what is your favorite Brian Jones song and what you think about this new video format. Until then, I am your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Hey guys, thanks again for checking out this video. Now if you want to see more Rolling Stones, I put my review of their Satanic Majesty's request, as well as my review of the 50th anniversary edition of the very same album. So have fun and click away.